After focusing primarily on the Chinese Song dynasty in the first video on Chinese economic history, we will now delve into the Ming and Qing dynasty. As we will see, the late Qing dynasty was characterized by a semi-colonial system imposed by imperialistic European states, which ultimately led to the decline of China's interterritorial and extraterritorial order. But first of all, let's start with the Ming Dynasty, which ruled China from 1368 to 1644 and reactivated the legacy of the Song, initially by building upon the already established innovations. Remarkable bureaucratic surveys were conducted during this period to restore former grandeur, culminating in the four registers. The Yellow Register recorded the population. The Fiscal Register was used for the distribution of land to the population and their respective tax burdens based on the quality of the land. Additionally, there was the Tax Collection Register and the Li Chia Register, which designated units, such as villages, where taxes were to be collectively raised. This level of administration and governance was unimaginable in Europe at that time. The reactivation of the tributary trade led to about 40 to 60 states paying tribute by 1420. The imperial court evolved into a power struggle between the Confucian Mandarin and the eunuchs, who tended to think in terms of state capitalism. These power poles only agreed on one thing: not granting political influence to merchants. This was achieved, among other measures, by curtailing private overseas trade, since about 50% of foreign trade was conducted by the state. As well, important to note within the Ming era are the 7 major expeditions starting in 1405. They were launched under the leadership of the eunuch Zhang He. While the Portuguese cautiously explored along the west coast of Africa, these Chinese expeditions reached the Red Sea and the East African coast. The goals of these expeditions likely included the search for precious metals, the demonstration of Chinese power, and the expansion of the tributary system, or the restoration of the old trade system. The wooden treasure ships used for the expeditions reached a technical maximum length of 85 meters. By comparison, the caravel used by Columbus 100 years later was only 26 meters long. Also, other innovations in shipping industry are noteworthy. The main combat ship of the Ming, for example, measured 55 meters, making it more than twice as long as the later European galleon. In the early 14th century, the Ming possessed about 180 units of these main combat ships, along with 36 treasure ships, 700 horse transports, and 300 troop transports. The horse transports were needed to import horses in large numbers, which were indispensable for securing the northern borders against the mounted nomadic tribes. Due to their strategic importance, horse trade was the only sector for which the imperial court officially allowed private trade. The hegemonic decline, however, began with the ordered scrapping of the fleet, the increasing suppression of private overseas trade along the coast, up to its prohibition, the ban on building seafaring warships, and the costly reconstruction of the Great Wall of China from 1436, into which a considerable amount of American silver imported via Spanish galleons from the Pacific flowed. In 1525, an historically unique edict was issued to destroy all ocean-going ships. This self-castigation can only be explained by a radical isolationism out of panic over a second foreign rule, which the Confucian Mandarins were able to enforce at court in their power struggle against the eunuchs. The prohibition on maritime trade was only lifted in 1567. Indian merchants, from Gujarat in particular, filled the vacuum between Malacca and the Arabian Peninsula, which occurred due to the Chinese prohibition. However, this trade operated without military backing, coming historically closest to free trade and therefore having little to counter the Portuguese galleons, which gained complete naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean by destroying an Arab fleet in the Battle of Diu in 1509. China's second isolationist turn, the first occurring at the end of the Song era, allowed the sustained success of European colonists. Had the eunuchs prevailed in 1405, It would have likely led to Pax Sinica and prevented the European world conquest from 1492 onward. Moreover, had the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean 75 years earlier, they would have stood no chance against the Chinese Navy, which ensured the public good of secure trade routes there. The Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, came to power in 1644 and ruled until 1912. Its rise was enabled by internal corruption, economic difficulties, famines, and peasant uprisings at the end of the Ming-Dynasty, as well as the strong military organization of the so-called Eight Banners. After the population declined from 160 million in 1600 to 138 million in 1700 due to the many crises at the end of the Ming Dynasty, it began to grow to 400 million by 1850. This growth was based on further agricultural innovations of the Qing, such as the expansion of multi-field agriculture and mixed crops, the introduction of new grain crops like sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts from America, and new organic fertilizers. Nevertheless, soil degradation, erosion, desertification, as well as floods and droughts were ongoing challenges in Chinese history that often led to disasters and whose prevention and mitigation were of the highest priority. Therefore, drought periods and the resulting social unrest were combated with state grain reserves sold below market price, tax relief, local soup kitchens, and public shelters for famine refugees. Enormous administrative capacities were provided for the maintenance of dams, irrigation systems, disaster protection, and emergency aid. For this, the civil service apparatus and, as a prerequisite, the state examination system were massively expanded. While there were 30,000 candidates for the state examination system in 1400 with 65 million inhabitants, there were already 500,000 in 1600 and almost 3 million by the end of the 18th century. According to official tax data from the mid-18th century, state revenues came from 73.5% land taxes, 11.9% salt taxes, 7.3% domestic and foreign customs duties, and again 7.3% from other sources. Chinese law during the Qing era was among the most developed in the world. The regulation of private matters was largely left to the involved parties, with disputes and sanctions decided by family members, village elders, or local elites. Magistrates primarily judged commercial and criminal cases, but their decision-making was not covered by commercial and civil laws, leading to some uncertainty regarding private ownership. While property rights were clearly defined, they were subject to possible arbitrary confiscation by the government, which could not be legally challenged. The intellectual development of the early Qing era bore many similarities to the European Enlightenment. Common patterns included the comprehensive creation of encyclopedias, the restoration of original texts, the desire to overcome metaphysical speculation or emphasize rational arguments, the precise empirical recording of the world, and the development and differentiation of sciences. The Enlightenment was thus not solely a European phenomenon, but occurred in a context of global synchronicity in which China played an important role. It should not be underestimated that the European scholarly world came into contact with enlightened Chinese thought through translations by European missionaries from 1687 onwards. While Chinese science also benefited from European insights brought to China by Jesuit missionaries, it is argued that only 4 of the 17 technical innovations brought by the Jesuits were likely new to China. However, imports of Chinese-produced goods to Europe led to sociocultural alignments, such as the social phenomenon of coffee and tea drinking and the imitation of Asian cotton and porcelain products. Printed wallpapers, umbrellas, toilet paper, and pajamas also came from China to Europe. Furthermore, European enlighteners could only fully realize their ideas by acknowledging the existence of an older high culture, as if the Chinese historical works predated the biblical chronology, and if the flood did not exist in Chinese records, Was the entire biblical history based on the Bible falsified? The fact that the most famous European enlighteners, like Leibniz and Voltaire, engaged intensively with China and developed a cinephile trend is unknown to most Europeans. However, cinephilia was not universally shared. For Montesquieu, China was a despotic political system based on fear. Rousseau saw in China a tyranny over a slave people, necessarily resulting from the fall of civilization. Economically, after the destructive Ming-Qing transition, China returned to its expansive path. Reasons for this include the stable continuation and improvement of existing techniques and institutions, the massive expansion of commercial transport infrastructure for faster and larger-scale handling of goods, the resumption of private maritime trade, and the strong urban population growth. Private domestic and foreign trade, the use of silver as currency, and merchants were increasingly accepted and even promoted from the 17th century onwards, due to a school of thought that emphasized the natural law of the market economy and a market with appropriate incentives instead of state control. Pragmatic attitudes towards trade prevailed at the imperial court once again and became government policy in the 18th century. Market development was significantly driven by Qing tax policy, as all Chinese had to pay at least part of their taxes in silver, requiring farmers to sell their products on the market. Additionally, new production and distribution sectors were subsidized through incentives for entrepreneurs. The expansion of the market economy led to the differentiation of commercial sectors. Particularly noteworthy sectors are agriculture, salt and sugar production, oil pressing, textile production, dyeing, mining, metallurgy, tool making, paper and ink production, armament manufacturing, pearl polishing, shipbuilding, pottery and porcelain production, and banking based on the so-called Shanxi banks. Positive foreign trade, primarily based on silk, tea, and porcelain, brought enormous amounts of silver into the country, which functioned alongside copper as currency since the Ming-Dynasty. It is estimated that at least 30% of the silver mined in North and South America flowed into China. Without this silver demand, for instance, due to exclusive use of paper currency in China, Europeans would not have been able to finance their imports with American silver, and history would have unfolded differently in many ways. As a result of the silver currency from 1720 onwards, the Mexican silver dollar was even used as the main payment method in the southern Chinese business world. From the 1760s, the so-called Canton system was introduced, wherein only selected points chosen by the emperor were open for foreign trade. Thus, Guangzhou became the main port for all European cargo ships. Besides taxation and curbing smuggling and piracy, security concerns due to the annexation of the British East India Company in India were the primary reasons for this measure. By trading Indian cotton for tea, porcelain, and silk in Guangzhou, the Qing gained attractive customs revenues. The East India Company, aiming to increase trade volume, sought to open additional ports in northern China and sent representatives with gifts such as clocks, telescopes, weapons, and textiles to the emperor's court. The Qing court treated the British delegation as a tribute mission, but when the delegation refused to perform the so-called kowtow ceremony, a deep bow with the head touching the ground, the emperor denied them an audience. Additionally, the East India Company faced competition from Chinese merchants selling cotton produced in northern China to the south of China. To finance the ongoing tea boom in England, where the average family spent about 5% of their income on tea, increasing amounts of opium were shipped to China as an alternative to cotton. Despite repeated Chinese bans, the increased opium supply drove its demand up. The outflow of silver from China to England due to opium purchases significantly contributed to the expansion and maintenance of British trade presence in China. In June 1840, the First Opium War began, which the British Army won thanks to new technologies, notably steamships and new rifles. The Treaty of Nanjing in August 1842 was the first of the so-called unequal treaties and opened China to the West. Additionally, the island of Hong Kong was ceded to Britain indefinitely. Extraterritoriality for British subjects in China was established, and British merchants expelled from Guangzhou during the war received reparations amounting to 21 million silver dollars. The Second Opium War followed from 1856 to 1860, leading to the permission for foreigners to navigate the Yangtze River, the free spread of Christian missionaries, the legalization of opium, the slave-alike coolie trade, and the permanent establishment of foreign diplomats through embassies in Beijing. The Second Opium War culminated in the official declaration of war by the Western Allies and their invasion in August 1860, which symbolically peaked with the looting of the old summer palace in Beijing. Over time, Western technologies and institutional forms, notably the Shanghai Stock Exchange and limited liability companies, established themselves in China through treaty ports and their semi-colonial structures. From the early 20th century, foreign investments began flowing into Chinese industry on a large scale, as the Chinese capital market offered higher interest rates following industrialization in Europe and North America. The relative global economic decline of China began only when Europeans increasingly started producing goods like porcelain themselves and failed to adopt Western inventions of the first half of the 19th century, such as electricity, the modern chemical industry, and especially the military industry. This is attributed to the Taoist non-action, the Wu-Wei approach or laissez-faire of the Qing, and the lack of financial institutions. Unlike the Netherlands and England, China did not have a public debt market to finance wars and increasingly costly capital investments in new innovations. The absence of essential financial instruments for 19th century industrialization, such as joint stock companies, government, and private bonds, significantly contributed to the imperial exploitation of China by European powers. This European dominance resulted in the comprehensive transfer of science and technology from the West to the East, along with their organizational forms and ideology. On the already imperialism-weakened empire, the Northern Famine from 1873 to 1876 struck, triggered by the most severe El Niño conditions in 500 years. It affected 160 to 200 million Chinese, of whom at least 9.5 million died. This famine led to the largest human movements of the modern era from inland China. The environmental crisis and overcrowded urban centers increasingly overwhelmed the empire. Recurring hunger caused rebellion, unrest, and organized crime in rural China. The White Lotus Rebellion from 1796 to 1804, the Nayan Rebellion from 1851 to 1868, and the Taiping Rebellion from 1851 to 1864 channeled the desperation of many residents and are just the most well-known rebellions that particularly affected China's periphery. Even intensive and partially successful reform efforts could not prevent China's historical low point in 1900, the suppression of the anti-imperialist Boxer Rebellion and the occupation of the imperial palace. Long after the Boxer Rebellion was suppressed, the 8 imperialist armies killed thousands of Chinese in so-called punitive expeditions and plundered cities. From 1900 to 1902, Beijing and Tianjin were placed under foreign occupation. As compensation for the loss of life and property damage, the Allies demanded reparations worth nearly twice the annual budget of the Qing government. These reparations, along with interest, were paid off over 39 years, significantly impacting the budgets of subsequent Chinese governments. In this environment, further fueled by Western ideas such as social Darwinism, constitutionalism, and nationalism, a Han Chinese nationalism and militarism emerged. The new political elites after the Qing increasingly viewed the 19th century as a time of national humiliation and called for national salvation and revolution. The extensive Qing reform policy between 1900 and 1910 could no longer reverse this momentum. In 1911, 14 provinces seceded from the Qing Empire and installed revolutionary governments. On January 1st, 1912, the Republic of China was founded. Ultimately, the imperial dynastic system of China imploded because Qing army commanders refused to defend, and local elites withdrew their support from the leadership. That's it for today. Thanks a lot for watching till the end. In the last video of our series about the economic history of China coming online soon, we will analyze the economy of the Republic of China and the following People's Republic of China, which has been ruling since 1949 and initiated the current Chinese resurgence. So stay tuned and see you soon.